Imagine a country torn apart by chaos, a brutal war, not against a foreign enemy, but between its own people. A war that would change the fate of an empire and give rise to one of the most powerful nations in history. This is the story of the Russian Civil War. Between 1917 and 1922, Russia descended into a bloody conflict between the Bolsheviks, also known as the Reds, who sought to build a communist future, and the Whites, a mix of monarchists, Democrats, and anti-communists, fighting to restore the old order. But this was no ordinary war. It was a war of ideology, of terror, of famine, and suffering. By the end, millions would be dead, and a new world power would rise from the ashes. This is the Russian Civil War. To understand the Russian Civil War, we first need to go back to 1917. Russia was crumbling under the weight of World War I. The people were starving, the soldiers were dying, and faith in the monarchy was gone. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, ruled with absolute power, but his rule was disastrous. His decision to join World War I had led to catastrophic losses. Soldiers were poorly equipped, and morale was at an all-time low. Back home, food shortages sparked protests. The people had had enough. In February 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd, now known as St. Petersburg. The army, instead of suppressing the revolution, joined it. The unthinkable happened. Nicholas II abdicated. Russia was now a republic, but the real battle for its future was only beginning. With the Tsar gone, a provisional government was set up, led by Alexander Kerensky. But this government was weak. It continued fighting in World War I, which the people desperately wanted to end. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a radical socialist group called the Bolsheviks was gaining power. Their leader, Vladimir Lenin, had a vision, a communist Russia. The slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," resonated with the exhausted people. And in October 1917, they struck. On the night of October 25th, the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd. The provisional government collapsed without much of a fight. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now in control, but not everyone accepted their rule, and that's where the real war began. The Russian Civil War officially began in 1918. On one side were the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, who controlled key cities like Moscow and Petrograd. They had a strong ideology and leadership under Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. On the other side were the Whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, nationalists, and moderate socialists who opposed Bolshevik rule. They had support from foreign nations like Britain, France, the US, and Japan, but they lacked unity and a clear vision. The war spread across Russia, from the frozen north to the far east. The Whites launched offensives from multiple directions, but the Reds had one major advantage. They controlled the heart of Russia, its railways, and industrial centers. The war wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was a war of terror. The Bolsheviks launched the Red Terror, executing thousands of suspected enemies, including the royal family in 1918. The Whites were no saints either. They carried out their own White Terror, killing Bolsheviks and Jews, burning villages suspected of supporting the Reds. But perhaps the deadliest enemy wasn't bullets or bombs, it was famine. The war disrupted agriculture, leading to mass starvation. Millions perished. Foreign powers also got involved. Britain, France, Japan, and the US sent troops, hoping to crush communism before it spread. But their efforts were half-hearted, and they eventually withdrew. By 1920, the tide had turned. The Whites were disorganized, divided, and lacking public support. The Reds, under Trotsky's leadership, crushed them one by one. In 1922, the war was over. The Soviet Union was born. Russia was now a communist state under Lenin's rule. But the scars of the Civil War would never fully heal. Lenin wouldn't live much longer. His death in 1924 paved the way for a new leader, Joseph Stalin, and with him, a new chapter of terror and dictatorship would begin. The Russian Civil War wasn't just a struggle for power. It was a battle of ideas that shaped the 20th century. The Soviet Union would rise to become a superpower, locked in a Cold War with the West. And even today, echoes of that brutal conflict still shape Russian politics. History is written by the victors, but the cost is always paid in blood.